If you read the official history of the formation and construction of Venice, many questions arise. For example, how did historians manage to establish the exact date of Venice's founding, March 25th, 421? There's no precise information about events from 100 years before that. One interpretation of events surfaces, then another. Here's the precision. Historians write that inhabitants of coastal areas, fleeing from the invasion of the Goths, settled on deserted islands of the marshy coastline. Not these Goths, mind you, but others, depicted in the mosaic of the Great Palace in Constantinople as a Gothic leader. However, they rushed to these desolate islands in the marshes. But what next? Everything necessary for construction was on the mainland. They probably asked the Goths not to bother them while they carried building materials. The initial settlers were mostly fishermen and hunters who could generally feed themselves. But building, they had to make do with what was simpler: branches, poles, and so forth. Everything changed in 568 when the Lombards, with their long beards, as the Russians say, invaded Italy. It seems the more noble residents had to move in with the fishermen and hunters. Somehow, they could negotiate with the Goths, but not with those long beards. Venice lacks a Peter the Great to deal with such unsavory folks. Wikipedia states that newcomers to residency weren't accustomed to living in small wooden buildings on water. They desired comfort and luxuries. Therefore, wise Venetians decided to live in safety. Indeed, it would not occur to anyone to travel 3.5 kilometers by boat to attack the very rich and noble inhabitants of Italy. They began to build stone buildings and palaces right on the water. To keep the buildings from sinking, they began driving many large piles deep into the clay. That's how you see piles driven today. The only thing these images have in common is the number of people involved. Do you believe that 2 people, without the aid of machinery, could drive an 8-foot larch pile that deep? Of course, larch is not very dense, but the idea is for the pile to go as deep as possible and to anchor itself, preferably by penetrating the solid layer of soil. In this way, both vertical stability and strength will be ensured. By the way, 1 million larch trees were used to build the cathedral, 100,000 of which were driven in as piles. So how did the sheer weight of St. Mark's Cathedral not crush these 100,000 larches into the clay layer beneath them? Because according to the official literature, there is no solid layer of soil there. That's just for the cathedral. So how many larch logs were brought to Venice for all the buildings? There are 2 versions explaining where these logs came from. The first version, the Alps, about 700 kilometers from the city. The second version, the larches were brought from Perm, 4,000 kilometers away. 700 is certainly less than 4,000, but that doesn't make it any easier. Have you ever seen a logging truck loaded with 20 or 30 trunks of fresh trees? Under that kind of pressure, the ground shatters. How do they transport that timber? Now imagine harvesting and then delivering that much timber over that distance without suitable roads and specialized machinery. For historians, everything is simpler. Cut larch trees anytime, load them on a horse, and off you go. How many carts could hold such logs without falling apart? Let's not dwell on the poor horse. Perhaps all the way from Perm to Venice is strewn with horse bones. Do you think that's all? Oh no, according to historians, they drove piles mostly from Perm, larch piles, you know, but the buildings themselves were constructed from Istrian stone, quarried on the Istria Peninsula, Croatia. They chose it because it was more amenable to processing and more resistant to atmospheric phenomena. That's another 250 kilometers over land, or about 110 by water. Yes, Venetians didn't seek easy paths. It's believed that the larch logs, submerged in petrified conditions without oxygen, explain the durability and strength of such foundations. Those larches that weren't fortunate now look like this. Let's summarize. A group of people on small islands in the marshy lagoon, in self-isolation, managed to organize the delivery of a huge amount of timber from territories far away. Somehow they persuaded the residents of those territories to live without wood for a while. The logistics of transporting such volumes of timber, at least from what's described, involved unknown methods. Who prepared and loaded the timber? And, most importantly, who paid for all this? Unknown. The extraction and delivery of building stone from the Istrian Peninsula on flat-bottomed boats, as historians write, also remain obscure. In the manuscripts, everything is meticulously detailed about who fought whom, who befriended whom over 1,500 years ago. Every name and surname are documented, even insignificant details. But when it comes to building structures and palaces, there are no drawings or plans. Builders seem to do as they pleased. There are only illustrated drawings, like two men with mallets, or schematic drawings showing huge buildings standing calmly on driven piles. There are photos too, but they don't specify what they depict or how they were used. Whether they dug up old foundations or built new ones is unspecified. The depth of the earthworks is quite substantial. Everywhere, the technology of building on water is described, but what if it's much simpler? People built a beautiful stone city on the Adriatic shore without struggling with driving their wood. They just laid their structures on strong stone foundations. Everything points to the fact that their construction technologies were advanced, and material delivery posed no problems. But there's a discrepancy here. If they had such advanced technology to build the most stunning cathedral, some techniques aren't familiar to us. Wouldn't it be more logical for two men to drive wooden piles if the foundation was stone or concrete? Do you think the builders of St. Mark's Cathedral couldn't have devised such a technology? So there stood this enormous, beautiful city on the sea's shore. Then a catastrophe occurred. The global ocean level rose. Parts of the city on higher ground remained, while the rest was flooded. Streets became canals where boats and gondolas floated. Satellite images reveal submerged canals and remnants of fortifications. The Star Fortress on the mainland part still has traces. Recall major floods in cities where people similarly navigate flooded streets. It resembles Venice. That city is Toulon, in the Irkutsk region. If the water doesn't recede, you could dock boats on your balcony. But if the flooding came and went, the global ocean level didn't return. People had to adapt to new living conditions. Of course, with the general decline and the loss of most technologies, they had to drive their larch piles for repairing old and constructing new buildings, but not on the scale depicted by historians. By the way, historians themselves point out the reason for the water-ricey, describing a very thick layer of fine clay under a thick layer of silt, a clay that fell from the sky and flooded buildings worldwide. The water surface of our planet is much larger than land. No one can tally how much of this clay fell into the global ocean, but it likely matches the extent of the overall water rise. Remember Archimedes and his cries while bathing in the tub? The question is different. Why do historians vehemently hush up this catastrophe? Not long ago, due to an unprecedentedly high tide, the canals of Venice became significantly shallow, revealing an intriguing sight. The bottom of the canal was paved with cobblestones. This suggests that people once walked and rode here, but not navigated by water. Steps descend from the houses to the very bottom of the canal, exposing the solid foundations of the buildings, but no piles are visible. Here you can see a door, which later had to be blocked, and traces of a platform built at least 3 times to protect the bricks from getting wet. Arc-shaped walkways were built to exit the house from each apartment. This photograph captures the routine cleaning of the canal from silt, but the piles are not visible. Historians sought to justify the construction of a metropolis on a swamp. Where else can we observe such incomprehensible construction in a swampy area? That's right, in St. Petersburg, on May 12, 1703. Peter the Great laid the city, which in Dutch was named St. Petersburg, which means the city of St. Peter. Quite modest and tasteful. Peter's companions complained about the rising water level. However, this only amused him. In September 1706, he told me that in his room there was water standing in his room, and on the opposite side, people were floating in boats through the streets like a river. Peter was amused to see people sitting on rooftops and trees during the flood. Even today, the city's elevation varies from 1 to 5 meters above sea level, quite a risky venture. Flooding in St. Petersburg in 1824, and of course piles, where without them, in a swampy area. A bit of background: the soil of St. Petersburg consists of hard, sedimentary and marine deposits lying at a depth of 20-30 meters under loose soil, such as clay, which requires strengthening due to uneven subsidence. Wooden piles 6 to 8 meters long were used for compaction, which somewhat reduced building deformations, as in Venice, down to a denser layer of soil and clay 10 to 30 meters. Put a multi-story building on them and see how it will wobble. By the way, do you know why the buildings in St. Petersburg and Venice are so similar? It turns out that the Tsar architect relied on the theoretical works of Vitruvius, Palladio, Scamozzi, and Vignola, all Italians, and one could think that these two cities were built by the same people. During excavations on Palace Square, another sidewalk was discovered under a layer of asphalt at a depth of 1.5 meters of clay soil. If scientists believe that it was built in the 7th, 8th century, then where did such a layer of clay come from in our country? There are many such filled sidewalks, both in Omsk and Novosibirsk. Note how many layers had to be laid to achieve a solid surface and stop this ugliness. You can see how badly the planet has been paved from the excavations of the Moscow Polytechnic Institute. Of course, they explain it by the subsidence of buildings and cultural layers. However, such explanations no longer raise a smile. Why not conduct an experiment on the layout to prove their theory? It would be fascinating to watch a massive building sink a couple floors into the ground without even cracking. One might also think of Amsterdam with its canals, where, as in Venice, people have sewage floating under their windows. After swimming in the canals, they are advised to get a tetanus shot, not because they planned it that way. They did have a sewer, but it flooded when the water rose. Historians dodge around, making up incredible stories just to cover up the fact of the disaster. Why do they do it? Subscribe to our channel. You are waiting for a lot of interesting facts that you have not heard about.